Hello, welcome to Apologetics 101, and we're starting right now. Hello, I am Brian Bowen. Welcome to my channel, Apologetics 101. I just got actually been pretty busy with recording videos. I just got through doing a very brief video like early this morning concerning the my official website, and that was a very brief video. I think it lasted about 7 minutes. I just wanted to be able to promote my website, and I'm going to include my website probably in my every link or every video description I get, because I want to continue promoting my website. It's got a lot of great articles on there. I'm going to put more articles on there. I'm including all my YouTube videos on there. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. Well, at any rate, today we're going to be talking a little bit about the Transcendental Argument. I have a interview with Dr. Jason Lau on this very subject matter on presuppositional apologetics and Transcendental Argument coming April the 13th. I can't wait. It's going to be a great conversation. Please join me for that. But today we're going to be talking a little bit about, we're not going to go as in depth as I am going to go when we talk about it with Dr. Jason Lau, but it'll be very brief. But I wanted to do a response video to a guy by the name of, I think his real name is Stephen Woodrow. His YouTube designation is Rationality Rules. And he makes a response particularly to Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument. He basically tells, he responds, he does like, it's a very short video, it's like 7 minutes long. We're not going to be watching the whole thing. We're mainly going to get to the bulk where his arguments specifically are, and he does like 3 or 4 arguments in response, counter arguments in response to Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument. Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument, we'll get a little bit more into that, but it's a little different than the way typically Transcendental Arguments are. Usually Transcendental Argument for the existence of God nails it down from all the other worldviews to one particular worldview. In this case, the Christian biblical worldview. The idea is that apart from Christianity, we wouldn't be able to know anything at all. It shows the truth of the proclamation of Christianity by showing the impossibility of the contrary. That's the object behind it. Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument does 2 things that I think are major differences. One, he focuses primarily on logical absolutes. Although logical absolutes is a big one in Transcendental Arguments for the existence of God, usually the Transcendental Argument may focus on other types of transcendental features as well, where Matt Slick just zeroes in on logical absolutes. Nothing wrong with that. Secondly, the second thing he does is he focuses his attention primarily on atheism. Whereas most transcendental arguments for the existence of God typically generally scopes out other worldviews and say these other worldviews cannot account for these transcendental features, but biblical Christianity can account for all of them. That's the object of it. But Matt Slick focuses primarily on atheism specifically. Now, Matt does categorize some stuff differently than me. Matt Slick's particular Transcendental Argument, he classifies it as a God position, no God position. And essentially we'll get a little bit more into this, but essentially the God position, he classifies anything that believes in the existence of God. He even puts polytheism in that category. You know, if you believe at least one God or more, that would qualify in that. No God position would include things like the group atheism and any worldview associated with them. It would include like Buddhism that has no God in their belief system, or or even maybe Satanism, possibly, unless Satanists might view Satan as some kind of god or something. But the object of it is whether or not if God exists or not exist. And so he takes the word God in a kind of generic sort of way for creating the universe, kind of like the way the cosmological argument does, and is suggesting that, okay, atheism, the position of no God position cannot possibly be true because you cannot account for logical absolutes. That's the gist of the argument. There's more to it, but that gives you at least the preliminaries of Matt Slick's argument. Now, Rationality Rules has to respond to this. Now, just to give Stephen the benefit of the doubt of Rationality Rules, he made this video in 2017. He said it was shortly after, within a very short period of time, probably after he had at least started his YouTube channel or something like that. Well, and so I realized that people's beliefs change over time. I mean, the way I argue changed significantly from the time when I first started my YouTube channel to now. So I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe if he's given another opportunity, maybe he would respond differently to it, possibly. But all I have for his response is the video he made in 2017. And that's what I'm responding to. Granted, he could have changed his mind since then, and I'm open to the possibility that he did, or be willing to respond, at least respond differently than he did at that time. Maybe he has a better understanding of the Transcendental Argument now than he did then. So I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt of the passing of time, but all I have is this 2017 video he made to respond to. So that's what I'm going to be doing. That's going to be response. Another thing I want to put out there is that I'm not, even though we're talking about Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument, my Transcendental Argument is different from Matt, and the general Transcendental Argument for existence of God that's usually made is different from the one that Matt Slick's made. So I'm not here to defend Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument, although Matt does have, if you don't know who Matt Slick is the founder of CARM. CARM is an acronym that stands for Christian Apologetics and Research Ministry. He's got a lot of good articles on there. He's got several articles defending his Transcendental Argument. So if you want to see a full, in-depth defense from the person who made this Transcendental Argument, I would suggest go to CARM, read some of the things that he's written on. He's made some defenses of it. So I'm not here to defend that. I'm more here as a kind of a general scope of the Transcendental Argument. But I will talk a little bit about Matt Slick's Transcendental Argument, because I do think Rationality Rules, who is attacking his argument specifically, doesn't quite understand either the Transcendental Argument in general or the one that even Matt Slick makes. And so we'll get more into that as we cover the details. Like I said, the video is not very long, but we'll be constantly stopping in it and talking about his particular arguments. Like I said, he made like 3 or 4 arguments, and we'll deal with that. Alright, here we go.
The full defense of Slick's Transcendental Argument can be found on calm.org, but as you can see from this screenshot, it's fairly lengthy, and most of his defense is either clarifying definitions or making assertions that are universally accepted, which is useful, but the argument itself is at the end of his defense, and it goes as follows. If we have only 2 possible options by which we can explain something, and one of those options is removed, by default the other option is verified, since it's impossible to negate both of the only 2 existing options. God either exists or does not exist. There is no third option. If the no God position, atheism, clearly fails to account for logical absolutes from its perspective, then it is negated and the other option is verified. Atheism cannot account for the necessary preconditions of intelligibility, namely the existence of logical absolutes. Therefore, it is invalidated as a viable option for accounting for them, and the only other option, God exists, is validated. Now, what Slick has attempted to do here, and as his first premise actually states, is present a disjunctive syllogism, which simply stated is a logical argument of the form that if there are only 2 possibilities, and one of them is ruled out, then the other must be true. Or in its logical form it is, A or B, not B, therefore A. In addition to this, he insists that his second premise, that God either exists or does not exist, is a valid dichotomy, because the two positions are mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive, meaning that both positions can't be true, and that one must be true because between them they cover all possibilities. And, if he's willing to slightly tweak the wording for clarification purposes, he's right. Either the Christian God exists or the Christian God does not exist. This is a valid dichotomy. But now we move to his third premise, and this is where things get a little bit...
Alright, just to clarify, I do actually think that Christian God exists or Christian God does not exist. But what he's claiming is a God position and no God position. And that could classify, and you could classify every religion in those two categories. So, as we're going to talk about a little bit, that actually is a valid dichotomy. He's claiming it isn't. He will claim that Slick is making the either or fallacy, also known as the black and white fallacy. But we'll get into that here in a second.
Tricky, slippy, and slicky. When Slick states that, if the no-God position, atheism, he is conflating the Christian God does not exist proposition with, and only with, the atheist position, which is not the only Christian God does not exist position. Buddhism is a Christian God does not exist position. Hinduism is a Christian God does not exist position. Egyptian polytheism is a Christian God does not exist position. And the list goes on and on.
Alright, we're going to deal with each one of these here in a second, using the Transcendental Argument, as I propose as well. But, out of all of that, he is right about one thing, that Slick does focus specifically on atheism. But what Matt is doing is essentially he is classifying everything in as a God or no God position. Whether you want to say atheism, Buddhism, Satanism as no God position, whatever the case may be, and polytheism, Islam, etc. What I think Rationality Rules is assuming is that he is assuming that Slick is creating the dichotomy as Christian God exists or Christian God does not exist. And that's not what he's doing. Actually, Rationality Rules is actually strawmanning Matt at this point. Matt Slick's argument is simply that God exists or that God does not exist. The way in which Matt appears to be classifying this in his argument appears to be, it's different from the way I would. I would classify as Christian God exists or Christian God does not exist. And all of these composite no Christian God. And I think that's the way Rationality Rules is taking it. But unfortunately, that's not the way, unfortunately for Stephen, that's not the way Matt is taking it. When Matt uses the two positions, God exists or God does not exist, he's basically lumping any other worldview that claims God exists, or at least one God, maybe more, exist in that category. I wouldn't do it that way, but that's the way he seems to be doing it. And atheism and any other no God position up in the other category. And so, if he is classifying it like that, it is a valid dichotomy. Because you could classify it just by any other worldview. He's simply showing that by default, atheism would be wrong. Now, of course, that's not the way most people usually do the Transcendental Argument. And all these other worldviews don't composite a Christian God either. And so, because of that, my argument as well is also a valid dichotomy, because I argue the proposition that Christian God exists or Christian God does not exist are polar opposites. And so is Matt Slick's argument. The fact, and by the way, Rationality Rules is also kind of setting up a red herring. The fact that even if you could have other worldviews that could account for logical absolutes, that would not mean atheism does. I mean, it just doesn't. But let's take the Transcendental Argument to its full extent. Can any of these other... but by the way, he might also be conflating religions and worldviews. Those are not exactly synonymous with each other. Although religions could be are part of worldviews, as well as non-religious groups, we all have a worldview, And atheist worldview, there's multiple worldviews that can actually be classified in atheism. You know, like naturalism, materialism, empiricism, and even modern day humanism. Those are all worldviews that can be classified under, or that atheists have been known to take. So it's not unusual for atheists to take more than one of those worldviews, although only one of them could be their ultimate standard. Now, let's take into question all these other non-Christian worldviews. Could they explain the question of logical absolutes? Now, keep in mind, like I was saying, that atheism, that worldviews can actually, a particular group can actually have multiple worldviews, and as well as several religions could be part of the same worldview. In the case of, for example, Buddhism and Hinduism, they're actually part of the same worldview of pantheism. So that's interesting to keep in mind. Also interesting to keep in mind is the fact that as a religion, Buddhism rejects the idea of the existence of any god, whereas Hinduism accepts gods, but they're viewed through a pantheistic viewpoint where those gods are seen as representations of forces of nature, because they believe in pantheism, which is the divine dwells in the material world. Buddhism also exercises pantheism, but they don't believe in gods. They don't divide that using a kind of god. So don't think of any gods, whether there or not, in these religions of pantheism as being the same thing as what we would normally understood as a god. Let's look at Buddhism first. Buddhism doesn't posit any god. They're really in the same boat as atheism. They have no justification for the laws of logic at all. Alright, what about Hinduism? Hinduism, like I said, has gods, but they're not material gods as or gods existing as beings, external to reality as we would normally understand them. They see their gods as representations of forces of nature because they believe them being part of nature, part of the natural world, part of the universe, and that's called pantheism. And you can never get logical absolutes, a justification for logical absolutes out of that, because laws of logic are immaterial. They're transcendent features. You can't really disprove a law of logic without proving it true, because you'd have to apply the laws of logic to try to disprove it. So they become a transcendental necessity. You can't. It's impossible to prove them without affirming them. All right. So you can't get the laws of logic. They can't provide justification for laws of logic, which are, by the way, immaterial. So, what about Egyptian polytheism? Egyptian polytheism and Norse polytheism is actually part of the same worldview. They have different religions, yes, and different beliefs along those lines, but they're still part of the same worldview of polytheism. And multiple gods whenever you have a worldview of or religion that occupies multiple gods, you always end up having a lack of unification as part of that. So you got the world and the universe being created out of chaos, and you end up with the gods constantly bickering with each other, fighting with each other, constantly disagreeing. There's no unification of thought whatsoever. And as a result, you can't imagine that the laws of logic, which are really heavy on contradictions, in 2 points propositions contradicting each other, and suggest, in order to make sense out of reality, and could get that from the minds of multiplicity of gods that can't even agree on anything. You wouldn't be able to get any kind of justification out of that. Islam is monotheistic, but you can't get the laws of logic out of Islam either. They see their God as more impersonal and like this God over the universe that's just judging us. And so, in addition to that, With Islam, you have all sorts of contradictions actually occur within their belief system. For example, the Quran says listens to the Injil, which is the Gospels, but then they contradict the Gospels by denying or rejecting Jesus' crucifixion. You also have other issues, like the fact is that the Quran claims to be the Word of God, but then the Quran admits that Allah deceived his enemies by making it look like Jesus had died by crucifixion. So you wind up with these inconsistencies that does not strike to us as being unified thought that could express the laws of logic. So none of these worldviews actually provide an actual justification for the laws of logic. Christian biblical worldview does, because God is considered a transcendent being. He's immaterial. He's non-spatial, meaning he could be everywhere at once. He can't point to a particular location and say God, it can only be there. I mean, God might manifest himself in some sense there, but he is omnipresent. He can be everywhere at once, and he knows everything, and he's omnipotent. That's within the Christian system, within the Christian biblical system. So that grants us a justification for the laws of logic. These other belief systems don't possess justification for laws of logic. And that's the bottom line. That's our bottom line. I think if someone were to challenge Matt Slick on this, I think Matt Slick would probably admit that none of these belief systems or worldviews can provide a justification for the laws of logic either. I think the only reason, but his article is primarily, as I mentioned at the beginning, focused on atheism. That's what it's primarily targeting. But the Transcendental Argument for the Existence of God, TAG, which is an acronym for it, it's usually called, and that's generally used, is usually used to narrow down that all these other worldviews cannot explain things like logical absolutes, objective morality, the problem of the one and the many, which by the way is resolved in biblical Christianity by the Trinity doctrine, the identity over time, the concept of self, consciousness, those are all things that can be accounted for in the Christian biblical worldview. You can't really account for them in other worldviews. Like I said, Islam has Allah deceiving his enemies by making it look like that Jesus has been crucified. Well, why should I trust anything he says? But the Bible clearly tells us that God does not lie. It's impossible for God to lie. And God doesn't contradict himself, because the Bible says God does not deny himself. So we see that all throughout Scripture, that the laws of logic are being yielded to, and that they come from the very thoughts and mind of God. You cannot account for them in any other worldview. Whether you're talking about atheism, Buddhism, Hinduism, whatever you want to throw out, you cannot account for it. But like I said at the beginning, this is kind of a red herring that he's throwing out there, because rationality rules is not presenting a justification for the laws of logic within his own worldview. That's pertinent, because here's the thing: even if you could claim that other worldviews can account for logical absolutes, would that mean atheism can account for logical absolutes? No, it doesn't. And it seems like he's beating around the bush on that he's pointing at all these other worldviews and say, well, you haven't thought of these. But that doesn't mean that atheists, even if they had a justification for logical absolutes, and I would argue definitely that they did not, but even if they did, that would not mean atheism does. And I think rationality rules, Stephen, is missing the point.
And on, meaning that even if the atheist position cannot account for logical absolutes, which is an assertion that I don't accept, it does not logically follow that only the Christian God can.
He says it's an assertion he does not accept, but he does not provide any justification throughout the rest of this video on that. Alright? And as a result, he said, okay, even if that's the case, it wouldn't mean it account for all these. Well, that's not the point. The point is, atheism cannot account for it, even if you did. Now, that's the point that Matt Slick is making. Now, that's the way he argues his transcendental argument. Now, I would personally argue it that none of these other worldviews also account for logical absolutes. They can't account for the laws of logic in that world, in that particular system of beliefs. And if Rationality Rules thinks that they do, then the burden of proof is on him to provide that. Okay, because I just provide the reasons why that wouldn't be the case. If he says nope, that worldview does. Okay, give me some justifications that each one of them would have in logical absolutes. The mere possibility of a justification doesn't mean that they have justification. Within that system of beliefs, show me a justification for logical absolutes. They don't have any. And even if they did, it would not, just to kind of flip Stephen's argument back onto him, it wouldn't mean that atheism can account for logical absolutes. He's arguing against Matt Slick's argument, which is primarily focused on atheism, mind you. And if he's going to say Matt Slick is wrong, then he's going to have to provide a justification that atheism can account for logical absolutes. And I would challenge Stephen to do that.
Or in other words, Slick's third premise commits a subtle but game-ending black and white fallacy, because it implicitly asserts that only one of two positions can account for logical absolutes, that being Christianity or atheism, when, as we've just demonstrated, these aren't the only positions. Alright.
The black and white fallacy is also known as the either-or fallacy. This fallacy is committed when two different positions do not contradict each other, but they are not exclusively mutual. That you can actually have other alternatives, in which case other alternatives are then not considered in the fallacy, and so only one of these two positions are therefore assumed. Now, this would only be the case if the two positions are not polar opposite from each other. Okay, understand this. It will only be the case if two positions are not polar opposite. He mentioned earlier about Christian God exists, the Christian God not exist. Those two are exclusively mutual of each other. They're polar opposite of each other. Okay, that means there's no way one could be true without the other being false. This is in accordance to a law of logic called the law of excluded middle, and therefore, according to the law of excluded middle, if A, it's either A or non-A. That means it either is true or false. You can't sit there and have it both true. You can't have it both false. You can't have all the alternatives. It's either one or the other. The reason is because these two particular propositional claims are in opposition to each other, and there is no third option as a result. And so Matt Slick is making a logical case on the basis of law of excluded middle, and he actually does mention the three laws of logic in his argument, in his article. So now Matt is categorizing these things differently than I would. The way I would have categorized it is the Christian God exists, Christian God does not exist, and I'll put all non-Christian religions and non-Christian worldviews in that category, and I will put Christianity in the category of the Christian biblical God. Christian biblical God exists. The Christian God exists. I would put it in that category. Now, what Stephen has done is he's assumed that's what Matt here is doing, but he thinks that Matt is then not considering other alternatives outside of Christianity worldviews. But that's not what Matt is doing. Matt is actually setting up a valid dichotomy because he is classifying it in such a way that it will include other worldviews that include the existence of God or not existence of God. Either way, this would be a valid dichotomy. And Matt is right. And so this abides by the law of excluded middle. I don't agree with how he's classifying it, just to throw that out there. because I wouldn't have categorized it that way at all. But that's the way Matt seems to be categorizing it. So he is going by two possible options. You could sit there and argue, well, other worldviews could be true, but that would be classified in the other category. Either way, Matt is right. There's only two possibilities as a result. So Matt is actually not committing the black and white fallacy. What he's doing is he's yielding to the law of excluded middle. The problem is that this is a kind of a common mistake that people make. Rationality rules is confusing the black and white fallacy with the law of excluding middle, which is not the same thing. Because the black and white fallacy is only committed when the two options in question are not polar opposite from each other. If Matt's argument as well as mine, the two propositional statements are polar opposite from each other. As a result, it is yielding to the law of excluding middle, and therefore it's not the black and white fallacy. Now again, to give Stephen the benefit of the doubt, it is possible that Stephen would change his responses by now. This video was made in 2017, but this is what he presented then.
And this puts Slick in a very difficult situation. He must either go back to the drawing board and comprise a new argument, or he has to adopt the impossible burden of proof of first knowing every single position or worldview currently known and currently unknown, and then prove that each of these positions cannot account for logical absolutes before he can legitimately say that the...
Alright. Why does Rationality rules think that this is an impossible task? That's the question. Okay, there's only four things that can make something impossible. Okay, either one, it's physically impossible. In other words, it violates the law of the physical universe. Two, it is logically impossible, that it violates a law of logic. Three, it is unattainable by human standards, that we're unable to attain that information. Like to say, it's impossible for us to know what goes inside a black hole, because we can't actually get to a black hole, and even if we could, we would never survive the trip getting close to a black hole because the gravity would pull us apart, and so forth. So all we have are theories about what goes on inside of a black hole. We don't know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, and it's just impossible for us to know that because it's unattainable for us. The fourth way to make something impossible, if it goes beyond human limitations. I assume that this is the fourth meaning behind the statement, but human limitations means that within my human ability, I'm unable to attain that information. For example, it's impossible for me within my human limitations to know everything in the universe. So you could say that's impossible. In this case, this would not be impossible because the list of worldviews are actually unlimited. And I don't know why he thinks that worldviews are unknown. I've never heard of anybody saying, well, there are worldviews nobody knows about. I never heard anyone say that before. That's unusual. Worldviews, like religions, are limited in the amount of worldviews that exist. And religions are the same thing. There's a lot of them. And there's new religions coming up all the time, possibly new worldviews every now and then. When that happens, we do know about them. They're not impossible for us to know about them, but there's quite a bit of them. So it seems to be that he thinks that because there's a lot of religions, and he may even be conflating religions with worldview, they're not exactly synonymous with each other. Because like I said, one religion could contain, or one belief system, or one group of people can contain multiple worldviews, while other worldviews may be contained, or several religions might be part of one worldview. That's possible as well. And also, there's even non-religious groups that hold worldviews. Atheism, which is usually considered a non-religious group, although some people dispute that, whether they're not religious or not. But just the same, let's just say the normal terminology, what we normally claim is religious, and claim they're a non-religious group, but they still hold worldviews. They still have worldviews. The usual worldviews, as far as the main worldviews within their scope of their positions is naturalism, materialism, empiricism, and humanism. That's usually the ones that I know of. Now, there could be others. But why would it be impossible for Matt to know every worldview? Why would that be impossible? Let's see. We mentioned there's 4 things that would make something possible. Is it physically impossible? No. It doesn't violate a law of logic or a law of physics for Matt to know how many worldviews exist in the world. Is it logically impossible? No, it doesn't violate a law of logic, so it's not logically impossible. Is it unattainable? No, because the amount of worldviews are limited. Is it beyond the scope of human limitations? No, because even if you want to assign like alien, worldviews or something, there's no evidence at all aliens exist, and so that would be special pleading and possibly even begging the question. But it would not necessarily be. So worldviews would be specifically limited to Earth. And the amount of worldviews on Earth is very limited. So why would that be beyond human limitations? Why would it be beyond Matt's human limitation to know every worldview on Earth? That's not impossible. Now, if he tweaked the word and used the word improbable, that would strengthen the argument a little bit than saying impossible. But if he does say improbable, then he's going to have an objective criteria by which to determine something probable or improbable. Otherwise, it turns out that it looks like it's just subjective, like he just thinks it's improbable, but not necessarily being improbable. So if he's going to say that it's improbable for Matt to know it, that would be a little bit stronger than saying it's impossible, not using as strong of a language as that. But it would still need an objective criteria by which to determine what's probable or improbable. Otherwise, it becomes kind of subjective, and you wonder why would he even think it's improbable to know it? Because it's a limitation. There's a limited amount of worldviews. There's a limited amount of religions that exist in the world. There's a limited amount of groups of people that exist in the world regarding the subject matter of either religious or non-religious viewpoints. And so why would that be, why would that be an impossible task? Why would that be an improbable task? And so he doesn't give the reason why. He just asserted it. I think he's trying to persuade everybody that something is impossible. If the idea it's impossible, then it's unfeasible. You just can't imagine that he could know that. That sort of thing. He's trying to persuade people in that perspective. But I don't think he's doing a very good job of that, because the fact is he doesn't have an objective criteria to determine what's probable or improbable, so it looks very subjective. And impossible appears to be too strong a word that doesn't fulfill those 4 criteria, which determines possibility or impossibility. And so why would he think that it'd be impossible for Matt to know all those worldviews? Now, do you really have to have all worldviews? Well, no. Because you have to be able, the object of it is really to account for logical absolutes and other transcendental features on the basis, justifiably on the basis of your worldview, of an internal critique of your particular worldview. Christianity can do that with all transcendental features. Now, in my opinion, I don't think other worldviews are capable of doing that, but if they think they can, like in the case of Rationality rules, then he's going to have to give us a justification for logical absolutes. Simply pointing at other religions and other worldviews and saying they might have it doesn't really show that atheism does. And that's the whole point. If you're going to attack Matt's argument, and Matt's argument is specifically focused on atheism, then you're going to have to provide a justification for logical absolutes within the atheistic systems of worldviews. Okay? So whatever worldview you take, provide that system can justify logical absolutes. Pointing at other worldviews and other religions doesn't accomplish that task. Let's continue.
The only other option, God exists, is validated, which, as I've just mentioned, is quite literally impossible.
Again, not impossible, and no objective criteria for making that determination of impossible or improbable.
And this means that it's checkmate. Game over.
No, it isn't. He has not refuted his argument, and if you really wanted to refute Matt Slick's argument on the Transcendental Argument, the best way is by providing a justification within your worldview, which he's attacking. He's attacking the atheistic worldview. You think that rationality would then give a justification for logical absolutes. I mean, that's the best way to do it, wouldn't it? Then why doesn't he?
Now, I'd normally leave it here, but after much consideration, I've decided to really hammer home this flaw by composing a very similar argument that suffers from exactly the same flaw in exactly the same way, but without the fluff. And so, for what it's worth, please consider the following. Valhalla either exists or does not exist. There is no third option. If the no Valhalla position, Hinduism, is negated, then the other option is verified. Hinduism is negated, and therefore it is invalidated as a viable option, and the only other option, Valhalla exists, is validated.
Alright. So he sets up this false argument. Now he admits this argument's bad, but he's trying to use that as an example of the argument he thinks Matt Slick is making. So let's look at that argument to see whether or not if it's a true example of what Matt Slick is doing. Alright. He says Valhalla either exists or does not exist. There is no third option. Okay, he says if there's no Valhalla position, Hinduism is negated, then the other option is verified. Alright, let me mention this right at the start of my evaluation of this false argument. Valhalla is actually not a belief system, nor a worldview. So this is actually a false analogy fallacy. Because Valhalla is not a belief system, worldview, or even religion. It's an independent belief within the Norseman mythology position. It's basically the Vikings' equivalent to heaven, is what it is. And Valhalla's existence or non-existence does not depend on any transcendental feature existing. So it wouldn't be justified. Like with logic, you can't disprove logic without affirming it, because you'd have to use logic. Truth is knowable. You can't prove truth is knowable without assuming truth is knowable. You can't disprove it without assuming truth is knowable. That's a transcendental feature. Valhalla is not a transcendental feature. There's nothing that necessitates that Valhalla has to exist for other things to be true, to exist. And it would not have anything to do with intelligibility to know anything at all. None of that would be the case with Valhalla. Alright? So Valhalla's existence or non-existence is not required by any stretch of the imagination. And then he says, if the no Valhalla position, which is a belief, not a position, or it is a position, but not a worldview system. And Hinduism is a religion. So these two are not exactly the same thing anyhow. And he says negated, then the other option is verified. Except Hinduism and Valhalla are not necessarily exclusively mutual. There could be other possibilities. For example, that Valhalla and Hinduism both are false. Those kinds of things. Because they're not directly contradict each other, and therefore is not part of the law of excluded middle. He's setting up an intentional false dichotomy in order to try to say this is what Matt's doing. Except Matt isn't setting up a false dichotomy. He's setting it up according to the second law, or according to the law of logic, the third law of logic, known as the law of excluded middle. And so this right here does not follow the law of excluded middle. There's nothing that says that Valhalla has to exist. Hinduism is a religion, and Valhalla is a place that's believed in Viking mythology. It's equivalent to their version of heaven. And there's nothing that says it has to exist or not exist on the basis of Norseman mythology, or on the basis of reality. And Hinduism is a religion, so it's not the same as Valhalla. And there's nothing that says that it has to exist or not exist. And these two positions are not polar opposites from each other, therefore they're not exclusive, because both could be false. So there could be a third option as a result. So this would commit the either-or fallacy, But this is not what Matt Slick is doing, as I already pointed out. He says Hinduism is negated and therefore is invalidated as a viable option, and the only other option valid exists is validated. This right here would be a valid argument, but it's not a sound argument, because he's committing the either-or fallacy on purpose to suggest this is what Matt is doing, but he's not doing that. He's going by the law of excluded middle. There is only two other options. There's only two options. He's classifying, categorizing it differently than most people would, and certainly more different than the way I would. I wouldn't classify it that way. And that might be what's causing some confusion, because Stephen is attacking the normal way in which someone would normally classify Christian God or Christian God does not exist. But even Christian God exists or Christian God does not exist is a valid dichotomy, as he himself admits in the video. Let's continue.
Just as within this argument, the Hindu position is but one of many positions that don't posit the existence of Valhalla. In Slick's argument, atheism is but one of many positions that don't posit the existence of the Christian God.
He uses atheism more of a generic view, but he's basically classifying all non-God positions in that position and all God positions in the other position, even polytheism. And so this is so it would be a valid dichotomy. I don't agree with the way he's categorizing it, but he is categorizing it this way, and because he is categorizing it this way, it is a valid dichotomy. The problem is, I don't think that Rationality Rules Stephen understands Matt Slick's argument fully.
And hence, just as the Valhalla argument commits a black and white fallacy, so does Slick's Transcendental Argument.
No, it doesn't. It actually follows, again, with the second law of Excluded Middle. Only one, if the two positions are polar opposites from each other, then only one position can be true and only one position can be false. There is, Slick says in his argument, there is no third option.
And because of this, the conclusion of both arguments are non-sequitur.
The second argument is definitely logically unsound, because it's either-or fallacy, and false-analogy fallacy too, because he's trying to make it as a contrast to the kind of argument that Matt's making, but Matt's not making that argument. Matt is making an argument which only includes two possible positions, and no other positions is optimal. Any position you make, you say, well, what about polytheism God? Well, that would fall in the God position. What about Satanism and Buddhism that don't posit God? Well, that would fall in the no God position. And pointing to other belief systems that don't posit the existence of God is only making the point for us, or for Matt, I should say. Again, my transcendental argument is not the same as Matt Slick's, but it would only make Matt Slick's point for him. It would also make my point for him too, when I used Christian God exist or don't exist, and then I would categorize all the other non-Christian worldviews over there with the proposition that Christian God does not exist. And that includes other religions that claim this, that would include non-Christian religions, and that would also include atheism. And I would include the Christian God does exist over there in the Christian biblical worldview.
And finally, I'm going to point out just one more ridiculous flaw with Slick's argument. If we switch the word God with Zeus, then the argument proves the existence of Zeus. Because if the no Zeus position, atheism, clearly fails to account for logical absolutes from its perspective, then it's negated, and the other option is verified.
Alright. Okay, here he's trying to bring his argument home, but it doesn't really equate again. Zeus is actually one god of an entire system of gods. So the actual worldview system is polytheism, which is multiple gods. So what a lot of people do is that they try to contrast a monotheistic system with a polytheistic system, and it doesn't work. Because in a monotheistic system, you have the existence of only one god in control and regulating everything. And in a polytheistic system, you have multitude, sometimes even a plethora of other gods controlling things. And when you have a plethora of other gods like this, you have a constant constant bickering back and forth. Another thing I forgot to mention is in polytheism often humanized the gods. They were very much like me and you. I mean, faults and failures. I think the Greek gods were immortal, but the Norseman gods could be killed. So that's a thing that actually happened in Norseman mythology, that they allowed their gods to die, just like me and you can die. In fact, if you look at Norseman gods, they look like Vikings. The way that they're designed, like Thor, look like Vikings. And very big comic book junkie, and so I like Thor in the Avenger movies and stuff, and in the comics. And you see Thor, and he's all dressed up with like a Viking, because in polytheism they humanized them. They were material. They weren't transcendent the way God is transcendent in Scripture. They were material, physical beings. They were very much like you and me. They fight and war among themselves. They couldn't possibly disagree. They lost their temper a lot. They was very humanized. They were very humanized. In the Bible, God is not humanized like this. In fact, there's one place where God says, "My thoughts are way above your thoughts, and my ways are way above your ways." Jesus said God is a spirit. Now, the Bible uses anthropomorphic characteristics in order to, which is trying to understand something using human language. In this case, trying to understand God using human language to understand Him. But it's automatically understood by scholars that this is anthropomorphic language, that the Bible presents God as a transcendent being, which is very different from polytheism. Now, this would account for logical absolutes, because logical absolutes, by the way, are transcendent. They're immaterial. They're spaceless. They're timeless. You know, the laws ain't going to cease to exist tomorrow or change, down the road somewhere. I can't walk down the street and trip over the law of non-contradiction. I can't take the law of identity out of the refrigerator and accidentally swallow it. They're not physical entities that like you and me are physical. So you can't expect them to have a material cause for their existence. No foundation of them can be possibly material. But the gods of polytheism were not transcendent. They were very much like you and me. They were very humanized. They were larger than life, of course, but they were very humanized. And here, what Stephen has done is he's took one god out of a system that allots for a multi-god system, which is polytheism, and try to use it to justify what he is claiming is ultimately Matt's argument. And you can't do that, because even if you wanted to do that, Matt is positing God. He's classifying all other God systems in that, and that will include polytheism. Okay, that will only make Matt's point for him. Now, with my system, I sit there in my Transcendental Argument. I do actually classify all polytheistic religions in the classification of claiming that no Christian God exists, of that proposition. But you look at polytheistic religions, and again, they humanize their gods. They're material, physical beings. They're very much like you and me, and they're constantly bickering back and forth. You don't expect this to be a way of justifying logical absolutes, which are, by the way, immaterial. And so, again, he's setting up a false analogy fallacy. Zeus is not a system. He's part of a system, namely a system that allots for multiple gods, not just one. So this is not a true, I wouldn't even say it's a true analogy of even the argument that Matt is making. Certainly not mine. And so again, he's making a false analogy fallacy, not a true contrast, not at all. And again, he's taking one aspect, in this case, the god Zeus, out of a system that allows for multiple gods. And instead of attacking the system, the worldview itself, he's taking one aspect of it out and saying it and using that. And you can't do that because we're not talking about just independent beliefs itself. We're talking about worldviews. Okay? Even if he conflates religion with worldview, you're still looking at a system of beliefs, no matter how you look at it.
Now, there are many more flaws with Slick's Transcendental Argument, and I've left a few links in the description to others exposing them, including Alex Malpass. But within this video, I've deliberately chosen not to point them all out.
A good video to get. Now, Matt that has had a debate with Alex Malpass, but a good video to get with Alex Malpass is the one where Jay Dyer debates him. He does a phenomenal job of defeating his arguments there, and Malpass does not do a very good job. I've never really seen any atheist ever refute any arguments ever made by Christians and creationists concerning the existence of God. Sometimes they'll hype up their responses on YouTube to make it look like they refuted it, but they haven't refuted it. There's no refutation, as far as I can tell, of any arguments for the existence of God. Ontological argument is probably the weakest of all the arguments for the existence of God, and it's the one that's least popular among Christian apologists. And I hadn't even found a refutation to the ontological argument. It's just less persuasive because it's not as strong as the other arguments. But I haven't even heard of a refutation to it. I mean, that's the weakest of our arguments. If atheists cannot refute the weakest arguments that's ever been proposed for the existence of God, you kind of imagine that they wouldn't be able to refute the other arguments either. They will respond to them, but they're not likely to refute them. All right, but anyway, and of course he gives atheists as his explanation of responding to it, responding to them. And I've dealt with arguments of Matt Dillahunty. I don't know who this guy is over here. And I've seen a debate with Alex Malpass and some of the debate with Alex Malpass and Matt Slick. But in any given case, none of them, as I've seen, can refute the arguments. And Matt has a tendency to dismiss things rather than offer it. I've seen Matt deal with other debates. Matt Dillahunty deal with other arguments of Transcendental Argument. Tyler Villa is one I've done a personal debate review of. I didn't deal with the Transcendental Argument much at that time because I wasn't really as familiar with it. That was the first time I ever came across that particular type of argument. So, but in that debate, he tried to dismiss the Transcendental Argument by saying that he thought that the laws of logic were descriptive rather than prescriptive, which isn't true. So try to understand prescriptive and descriptive. Prescriptive means that the laws of logic are prescribing something, making a ruling to regulate how people, in this case, how people think. Descriptive means they just describe the way we think. But that would not be true because, one, we actually use the laws of logic prescriptively to judge right thinking and refute bad thinking. And secondly, if they were just descriptive, if they were just descriptions of how we think, then everybody would think logically and none of us would ever violate a law of logic. So they can't be descriptive. So, and of course, the only other argument that Matt makes in that particular debate is that he tries to dismiss it and says he doesn't think atheism need to justify their existence. But yes, they do. As a worldview system, they are required to make a justification for the laws of logic. I think Matt is seeing it more like explanations. Like for example, this computer right here. I know some basic functions of the computer, but I may not know how everything works in the computer. But I don't really need to know how everything works to know that it works. And I think that Matt's looking at it like that. The problem, however, is that our question is more fundamental than that. Suppose I didn't believe that the computer engineers and programmers that created my computer and programmed the data into my computer even existed. Then I would like a justification for why my computer works the way it works and has the programming that it has. And so it's not just merely saying, okay, I'm comfortable with not knowing how this is. Rather, it's providing a justification. We're not talking about just believing. We're talking about providing a justification for, in this case, logical absolutes. Okay, that will be it for today. And thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Drop a comment in the comment section below. Thanks for reviewing my video, and also stay clear for next month. I may even take a couple weeks off before then just to get ready for the interview with Dr. Jason Lau. He's my favorite young earth creationist scientist. But today, or April 13th, he's going to be coming on my channel to discuss the presuppositional apologetics and the transcendental argument. Both, it's going to have it's going to be a big discussion. I'm going to talk about a lot of more details than I was able to talk in this video. So please, like I said, subscribe to my channel, hit that notification bell, stay alert, because my second interview with Dr. Jason Lau is coming April 3rd. And as always, stay in the know, and I will keep you posted.